The air in the Sonoran Desert didn't just feel hot. It felt old. It was a dry, ancient heat that carried the taste of flint and forgotten things. Elias knew this better than most. His pickup truck, a rust bucket Ford that had been his father's, was the only thing moving on a ribbon of asphalt that shimmered like a mirage. He wasn't driving toward anything, not really. He was driving away. Away from the phone calls from collection agencies, the final notice envelopes papering his kitchen table, and the hollowed-out feeling of a life that had somehow slipped through his fingers. His grandfather, a man of few words and hard hands, had always told him about the silo. If you're ever truly lost, boy, not on a map but in your soul, you go to the silo. It'll set you right. It was a family story, a tall tale about a place out in the deep desert, a relic from some defunct cold war project that his great-grandfather had supposedly worked on, a place where a man could find clarity. Elias had always dismissed it as the ramblings of an old man who'd spent too much time in the sun. But now, bankrupt and broken, the myth felt like the only solid thing left to grasp. He found the turnoff not by a sign, but by the skeletal remains of a windmill, its blades frozen in a perpetual silent scream. The road was little more than 2 ruts carved into the hardpan, leading him deeper into a landscape of jagged rock and sentinel saguaros. The sun bled across the sky, painting the clouds in violent shades of orange and purple when he saw it. The silo wasn't what he'd expected. It wasn't some rusted cylinder half buried in sand. It was a low adobe-style building, bleached the color of bone by the sun. Built into the base of a rocky mesa, a flickering neon sign buzzed like a dying insect. Simply read Motel. Below it, in smaller, fainter letters, the silo vacancy. Elias pulled into the cracked asphalt lot, the only vehicle there. The place was silent, a pocket of absolute stillness in the vast, whispering desert. The air itself felt thick, resistant. The door to the office opened with a chime that sounded like a spoon dropped on glass. The man behind the counter was tall and gaunt. His skin stretched tight over prominent cheekbones. He wore a crisp, outdated suit, and his smile was a practiced, bloodless thing. His eyes were the most unsettling part. They were the pale, flat gray of a dry riverbed, and they seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. "Elias Vanguard," the man said, his voice a soft, rustling sound. "We've been expecting you." A cold knot tightened in Elias's gut. How did you know my name?" The man's smile didn't waver. "We know all our guests. Your family has a long history with us. Room 7 is prepared. It was your great-grandfather's preferred accommodation." He slid a heavy brass key across the counter. No computer, no credit card machine, no registration form. Elias, too tired and too desperate to question the profound strangeness of it all, simply took the key. "My name is Mr. Alitzer," the man said. "The rules are simple. Checkout is at dawn, not a minute later. And whatever you hear in the night, do not leave your room." Room 7 was at the far end of the single-story motel. It was clean but dated, frozen in the 1950s. The air smelled of dust and ozone. The only remarkable thing was the window. It didn't look out onto the parking lot but into a deep, concrete-lined cylindrical shaft that plunged into absolute darkness, below and stretched up into shadow above. The actual silo, Elias realized. A cold draft emanated from it, carrying a faint, metallic hum that vibrated in his teeth. Exhaustion claimed him quickly. He fell into a thin, troubled sleep on the stiff bed. He was jolted awake hours later by a sound. It wasn't a loud sound, but a precise one. A soft, rhythmic scrape. Scrape, scrape, coming from the other side of the door. He crept out of bed and pressed his eye to the peephole. The hallway was empty, but the sound continued. Scrape, scrape, scrape. He looked down. A man was on his hands and knees, scrubbing the worn carpet with a stiff, bristled brush. He was scrubbing at a dark, rust-colored stain. He was humming a tuneless little melody, a nursery rhyme that Elias hadn't heard since childhood. As he scrubbed, he began to weep, soft, hopeless sobs that were more terrifying than any scream. Elias stumbled back from the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, the hallway was empty and clean. There was no stain. The desert sun was brutal and honest. Elias almost convinced himself it had been a stress-induced nightmare. He found Mr. Alitzer in the office, polishing a collection of old photographs on the wall. "Who was that man last night?" Elias asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Mr. Alitzer didn't look up from his polishing. "We have many long-term residents. They are undergoing treatment. It is best not to disturb them." His eyes drifted to the photographs. One, sepia-toned and cracked, showed a group of men in 1940s, workwear standing in front of the motel's foundation. One of them was unmistakably his great-grandfather, a younger, harder version of the man in the single photo Elias owned. In the center of the group stood a tall, gaunt man in a suit, Mr. Alitzer, looking not a day older. A different kind of chill, deeper and more fundamental, settled over Elias. He spent the day wandering the perimeter of the motel, a prisoner of his own choosing. The desert was a closed circle. Every direction looked the same, a labyrinth of rock and thorn. His truck, he discovered, wouldn't start. The engine turned over with a dead, hollow click. As twilight began to bleed the color from the world, he heard it. A voice, faint and distorted, carried on the wind. It was calling his name. Elias. It was his father's voice. His father, who had died of a heart attack 5 years ago. The voice came from the mouth of a narrow canyon, sounding weak and scared. "Elias, son, help me. I'm lost." A powerful, irrational urge to run into the gathering dark, to find the source of that voice, seized him. It felt like a hook set deep in his soul, but he remembered Mr. Alitzer's warning. "Do not leave your room." He backed away, retreating to the sanctuary of room 7 as the last light failed. That night the sounds were worse. Whispers seeped through the walls, voices of old friends, past lovers, people he'd wronged. They spoke of his failures, his debts, his deepest shames. Then came the sobbing from the room next door. It was a woman's voice, and it was weeping his mother's name. His mother, who was alive and well in a retirement community in Florida. He clapped his hands over his ears, but it was no use. The sounds were inside his head. He felt a pressure building in the room, a psychic weight that made the air feel like water. He stumbled to the window looking into the silo shaft. Something was happening in the darkness below. A faint, phosphorescent glow was rising from the depths, a swirling, nebulous light the color of a dead star, and with it came the memories. Not like remembering, but like reliving. He was 8 years old, falling off his bike, the sharp sting of gravel in his knee, the coppery taste of blood in his mouth. He was 16 on his first date, the overwhelming smell of his girlfriend's perfume, the nervous sweat on his palms. He was 25, being fired from his first real job, the heat of humiliation flooding his face. The memories came faster, more vivid. Joy, terror, love, regret, each one a perfectly preserved specimen, played back with unbearable intensity. He could feel them being pulled from him, drawn out like thread from a spool, flowing out of his mind and down into the glowing thing rising from the silo. He was a book being read aloud, a film being projected. He saw the entity then, not with his eyes, but in his mind. It was vast, ancient, and utterly alien. It had been sleeping here, in this place of perfect silence and isolation, for millennia. It didn't feed on flesh or blood. It fed on memory, on the raw emotional data of a conscious life. The motel, Mr. Alitzer, it was all a mechanism, a lure for the lost, the desperate, the memory-rich. The treatment was the harvest. The pressure became agony. He saw his life flashing before his eyes, not as a cliché, but as a literal, systematic deletion. The face of his first dog began to blur. The sound of his father's laughter became distorted, then silent. He was being hollowed out, erased. No. The thought was a spark in the emptying chamber of his mind. He focused on one thing, the one memory he had, the one he'd come here to find. His grandfather's words, spoken on the porch of his old farmhouse, the smell of cut grass and coming rain. "If you're ever truly lost, boy, you go to the silo, it'll set you right." But his grandfather had been wrong. Or, a more horrifying thought occurred to him. He had been a part of it. A Judas goat leading his own blood to the slaughter, generation after generation, to pay some unspeakable debt. The glowing presence was at his window now, a swirling galaxy of stolen lives. It pressed against the glass, which began to crack with a sound like snapping bones. Elias did the only thing he could think of. He didn't fight to remember. He fought to forget. He focused on the numbers. His social security number, gone. His phone, number, erased. The pin for his ATM card, dissolved into static. He threw his memories at the thing, not as treasures to be protected, but as chaff to jam its senses. He recited multiplication tables, song lyrics, the preamble to the Constitution, letting them be ripped away, creating a storm of meaningless data. The entity recoiled. It was a connoisseur, and he was offering it junk food. The light flickered, the pressure wavered. With a final silent scream of frustration that echoed in the void of his own mind, the presence receded, sinking back into the impenetrable darkness of the silo. The first rays of dawn were piercing the window when Elias collapsed. He woke on the floor, the room freezing cold. He was alive, but he was. Light, empty. He stumbled out of the room. The door to the office was open. Mr. Alitzer stood there, his gray eyes regarding Elias with a look of cold, clinical interest. Fascinating, Mr. Alitzer whispered. Most fight to remember. You fought to forget. A unique survival instinct. A pity it leaves one so hollow. Elias tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He knew he had a name, but the specific sequence of sounds was gone. He knew he had a past, but it was a featureless plane. He was a silhouette, a man-shaped void. Your account is settled, Mr. Alitzer said, placing a hand on his shoulder. It felt like dry ice. The debt is paid. You may go. He was led outside. His truck started immediately. He drove away from the silo, the tires kicking up plumes of pale dust. He drove for hours until he found a highway, then a town. He pulled into a diner, his body moving on an autopilot he didn't understand. A waitress with a kind face and tired eyes handed him a menu. "What can I get for you, hun?" He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He looked down at the menu. He recognized the shapes of the letters, understood they formed words, but their meanings were gone. The sounds of the diner, the clatter of plates, the murmur of conversation were just noise. He had no context for any of it. He was a blank slate in a world full of writing he could no longer read. The waitress's smile faltered. "You okay, sugar? You look lost." He looked up at her, and in her eyes he saw a reflection of a man he no longer knew. He had escaped the silo. He had cheated the thing that fed on memory. But in doing so, he had destroyed the very thing that made him Elias. He was free, but he was nowhere. He was a ghost in his own skin, adrift in a world that had no meaning, forever trapped in the silent, terrible peace of a self-inflicted oblivion. The horror was not in what he remembered, but in the perfect, pristine, and eternal nothing that he had become.